Hey everyone, welcome to the Produce Like a Pro channel. I'm Joe Carroll and I'm here in Nashville with one of my absolute heroes. When I started talking to Warren about, maybe talking to some of the people around Nashville, 'cause usually I'm getting interviewed, so this is, you'll have to forgive my interview skills, so I'm not used to this, but when I was coming up, I had two heroes. I had Bob Clearmountain, who, on the pop side of things, and I had Chuck Ainlay, who was dominating Nashville at the time. So luckily, I don't know, 7-8 years ago now, I got to spend some quality time with Chuck when we were sharing rooms in a facility down on Music Row, but I've kind of lost touch with him in the last couple of years and really excited to kind of catch up and find out what's going on in Chuck's world and give you guys some history and some things he's done, because he's, like I said, one of my idols. I make no bones about it, and I'd like to share some of that stuff with you. So, Chuck, thanks for having us out.
You bet, Joe. It's going to be fun.
Yes, it is. So relive some stuff. Yeah. So we are at Studio Phoenix. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's Peter Frampton's studio. It used to be, there was like Music Row, and that's where all the studios were. They've all kind of migrated over here to Berry Hill area of Nashville. There's, so many studios right in this neighborhood. It's crazy, but Peter bought this studio a number of years ago, and I do a lot of work with Peter, so he calls it my studio.
That's not a bad place to call home.
Yeah,
as you guys can see, we may do a little B-roll and show you some of the goodies that's in here. It's pretty fantastic. But to give you, I know a lot of you guys know of Blackbird, for example. We're 3 blocks away from Blackbird. We're in that area of Nashville. So just to name drop just a little bit, in addition to Peter Frampton and Jewel and Elvis Presley, Taylor Swift, George Strait, Dolly Parton, Reba McEntire. I don't know who you haven't worked with, honestly. But as you can understand why, I would like to interview Chuck. He's a master of all trades. In today's world of engineering, we kind of get segregated into, hey, I'm a programming guy, I'm a recording guy, this is the orchestral guy, here's the mix guy, here's a mastering guy. You were a jack of all trades, so to speak. You recorded it, you mixed it. You weren't one of those guys that ever got just pigeonholed into one genre, one task. You kind of, did it all.
Well, I'm not much of a program music kind of guy. I kind of tend to shy away from that. I like working with musicians and making music with, the collaborative style of making records. So I kind of shy away from the program, one part at a time kind of record making. But yeah, I actually started out kind of more in the rock world. And when I got hired by Jimmy Bowen to start doing his records, which were country, he at the time was basically running Nashville. I mean, he had 80% of the charts, just his productions alone. And he hired me to start working for him. And that's when I first kind of started doing country records. And he hired me because he kind of wanted that different attitude. He wanted to change the way country records sounded. So, I got my feet wet in country music, and it's been a great living,
It's led to a lot of things. You became known as, I think, a specialist in all things organic, all things real, acoustic drums, acoustic piano, acoustic guitar, fiddle, mandolin, real, background vocals, or whatever the case may be. That's not a bad thing to be known for, being a master of realism.
I mean, I never really considered myself to be really good at anything. I just worked really hard, as far as that goes, I mean, the musicians in this town are just so absolutely amazing, and their instruments sound incredible. And, one of the things I learned early on is the less you do, the better you are, I mean, I started out like, I had to patch every bit of outboard gear in and to feel like I was doing my job. And then I realized, you don't need to do that. It's like a good mic preamp, and that's a lot of it right there.
Maybe Al Schmitt was right after all.
Yeah, well, we all aspired to be like Al.
That's a fact.
Yeah.
Well, let's do just a little back story. When you came up, now, of course, it's standard. So many guys that get into the industry can't come through programs of some type.
Right.
Whereas when you think about, let's say, over the age of 40, a lot of times, it was the old style, apprentice. You came into a studio and you would assist under an established guy, like I did. But you did some of both of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I came in thinking I knew everything.
Yeah.
Like all young people, you think you know it all already. And my first real studio job was at a studio called Sound Lab. And Jim Cotton, he was a Memphis engineer who was the chief engineer there. He was a super vibe dude, man. I mean, he grooved to the music. He really interfaced with the producer, that whole, had that whole side of things covered. But he really preferred the technical side of it be covered by the assistant, if you'd call us that. I mean, back then we called them second engineers. So, like at this studio at any rate, I mean, I'd get set up everything. I'd get the drum sounds, and then Jim would sit down at the console and kind of do his thing, So I was kind of in support of him, and it was a great way to learn, because he would tell me when things didn't sound good and all that sort of stuff. But I got to actually have hands-on the console and work on big projects. And then when when a client would come in, couldn't afford him, then they'd get me or one of the other guys. So that was a great way to learn. And I just, from there, I kind of went to another studio, and I was chief engineer there, and just kind of, I never really did get to come up under anybody. I kind of had to just listen to records and what was going, I'd try and study the sound on the records that were like popular at the time, and I'd try and duplicate it. Like I remember hearing, gated reverb for the first time, and it's like, well, how'd they do that? And so I kind of worked it out in my head. And,
right. A lot of people were chasing their tail right around the release of that Peter Gabriel record.
Yeah. It was like, wow, what is that?
Yeah, exactly.
And there wasn't internet. Like nowadays, everybody can just Google something and find out how it was done. Back then you had to, figure it out for yourself, Or make it up.
You mean you just couldn't go to a plug-in and say, in the air of night, drum reverb? You couldn't do that?
No.
Wow, that's incredible. What a different concept. But now you did go to school as well.
I did for a short while. I went, I knew that I wanted to be a recording engineer and had some experience before, but I didn't know how to get in the business. And I found out Belmont College at the time, now it's Belmont University, that they were just starting a 4-year music business program, and they had a recording studio. And so I told my parents, I said, I want to go there. So I came down here. It was the second year that they had the program going, and there was only 25 students in the program at the time. So, and having had some experience, I was the guy kind of manning the console for almost all the classes, and then I'd stay up at night recording bands and not studying.
Right, so your grades were...
Yeah, they plummeted. But, after a couple of years, I decided to just go it on my own,
Yeah.
So.
Now, one of your first, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the first, really successful producers that, you found your way into, I think we've already discussed him, Jimmy Bowen.
Yeah, Jimmy Bowen,
I mean, gosh, he basically at one time, he was so powerful in Nashville, he even said, this is how much a session musician will be paid, period.
Oh, totally.
And it became the standard.
Yeah.
That's how much power this guy had. But now he had an interesting way, you guys worked a lot at what was Soundstage Studios.
Right.
In its early days. And I understand there were some, by the time I got to Soundstage, things were very different. But when you were working there with him in the early days, some things were kind of unique, right?
Well, initially, there was the front stage studio, and that was kind of, anybody could book that room. And they built a studio for him called Backstage. And at that time, it had a Neve console in it, 8078, no, what was it, 8060, well, whatever. It was 8068. And he had dual 24-track Studers and all that. That was kind of his style of working. And I was chief engineer at the castle, And we'd put one of these in, the first SSL in Nashville, in there, and we had digital. We had the 3M digital machines out there.
32 track on 1 inch, right?
Yeah. And anyhow, so Jimmy came out to Castle to do a project, and I was assisting the engineer, and it was like after several songs, Bowen wasn't happy with any of the mixes, and he said, well, you did this album that I love. Why don't you sit down and try a mix? And then that was that. I mean, after getting through that album, he called up, or had his assistant call me up and say, you know, Jimmy would like you to start working for him. So that's when I started working for Bowen. And so we did a lot of work at, you know, half a dozen studios in town. And he insisted they all have an SSL if they wanted his business, and they have a digital multi-track. So that's kind of how Nashville progressed quickly in the technical side of things. Was, I mean, and Bowen really changed things for Nashville, made it really,
absolutely.
So, but then eventually he took over the Front Stage studio.
This is where I'm going.
This is where you were going.
This is where I'm going, yeah.
And, you know, during tracking, Bowen liked to sit behind the console and kind of act as though he was the engineer as well as the producer. He kind of felt that the artist and the, you know, the musicians and everything would respect him more if he was kind of twiddling the knobs. So it got to the point he wanted to be so much like kind of in there with the band that he had us redo the studio and take out the wall between the control room and the studio. So it was a console sitting in the middle of the room with where the band was. It was you know, great concept, but it's a nightmare from an engineering perspective, because you can't hear over the drums, you know, even with cans on cranked.
So you had to get sounds with headphones the best you could.
Yeah. So you kind of like get sounds, then you take a break and you listen to it and dial in some things, you know. Yeah.
And back then, I don't think they had the kind of, you know, some of those noise canceling headphones and stuff that we have now with the, you know, that they make for drummers. I mean, at the end of the day,
you were just fried.
You were just exhausting.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
It's probably one of those days where hey, these are my standard EQ points. I'm gonna kind of go with what I think is safe, you know, and get it on tape.
Yeah.
Don't overcommit.
He was also, I mean, he had specific ideas about things, and to the point I only tracked for him a couple of times. It was he was kind of hard on the engineer. I think he kind of would put him down to make himself look more important in front of everybody. He was great to the musicians. I mean, like you said, he basically told them, I'm going to pay you all double scale, you know, but I want you available when I call, you know.
Right.
And that kind of changed the whole pay scale around town, because he was paying that much. If you wanted these great musicians, you'd have to pay that much too. But so at any rate, I just couldn't take that, and I told him I'd mix for him, but I wasn't going to track for him. But so he had specific ideas about things, like you could not like cut in the mid range, like you couldn't like EQ out in the mid range. So what you'd end up doing, because he would mess things up when he's behind the console, believe me. I mean, he would make things where you had to do some cutting if you wanted it to sound good. So what we'd do is we'd like go to another module at the other end of the console, do the EQ, you know, like that we wanted, and then do what would look right to him on the module. And he wouldn't know about that down at the other end of the console.
So is that like a monitor path only? You know,
No, I mean, we just had to double EQ things just so that he wouldn't know what you were doing, you know.
That's incredible.
Pretty
yeah. But man, I mean, what's some of the albums you worked on with him, though? I mean, the names were...
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I got to work with Waylon Jennings and like Jimmy Buffett and George Strait, a bunch of George Strait records, Reba McEntire.
If country music fans out there are swooning right about it, to be in the room with legends, you know, that. Now, you worked on was it a Glenn Campbell record?
Yeah.
Was that Jimmy?
That was Jimmy too.
Okay, now there's some legend about that, you know.
Well,
is it true?
I mean, number one, Glenn was one of the funniest people on the planet. I mean, he'd have everybody just in stitches all session long. But when it came to doing vocal overdubs, he was a little different that way. He said, "Man, I want to lay down when I do my vocals in the dark."
Nice.
So we had these baffles. They're just big, thick foam pieces that we'd have cut, and you could put them between instruments to kind of isolate things. So just laid one of those down on the floor, covered it with a packing blanket so it wasn't quite so nasty.
Yeah.
and then, put a 67 over it. But it was kind of weird, like,
yeah.
in the dark, here's Glenn Campbell laying on this, and you have to, like, try and mic him up,
Wow.
It's pretty wild.
So, and kick off the lights. He wanted it to be
He
dark?
wanted it completely blacked out, yeah.
So, like, gosh, I can't even, like, just to take a drink, and if you're the singer, like dodging around a large diaphragm tube mic in front of you, that had to be.
It worked, though.
Yeah,
I mean,
You can't argue with the success. So the legend is true, So sometimes it's false, sometimes it's true.
Yeah.
There you have it, Glenn Campbell, vocals on the ground in the dark. Yeah, wow. So tell us, one credit that's always stood out to me because, he died in 1977 is the Elvis Presley thing. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, all right, so, yeah, I mean, I didn't work
Obviously,
with
you were
Elvis.
not,
I didn't work with Elvis while he was alive, but I got asked to do a Christmas album of Elvis's. He had like about a dozen Christmas songs, and like only 3 of them were done on 16-track. All the rest were just done straight to mono. And so there was just a mono recording of these songs, but they wanted duets. So they said, "Can you do it?" And I said, "Well, I can try."
Yeah.
So my concept, this is before we had software where you could actually pull the vocal out of a track like we can now. So I got like Pig Robbins, who kind of grew up at the, who was relevant at the
Mr.
time.
Left Hand.
Yeah, he was relevant at the time and in fact, when he came in to the studio, he said, "Thank you so much for letting me play on this record." He said, "I never got to play with Elvis, and I always wanted to." So that was cool. But I basically put together a band of musicians who understood that style of recording, and we actually worked at the old RCA Studio B.
Elvis actually recorded there.
Yeah. Elvis recorded in A and B, and he recorded a lot out in LA and New York. But in Nashville, that was Chet's studio and where he recorded. So anyhow, we got the band to like play precisely what Elvis's band had played. So basically, when Elvis was singing, you had 2 bands playing. It kind of worked because, back in those days, the vocal was so loud, the band was kind of down in there. But but then when the duet was singing, you had to crossfade into just the band, my band, basically.
Wow.
And I had Bob Ludwig master it, and I was like kind of paranoid about the whole thing. Kind of basically took years off of my life. I mean, you're messing with history.
You're only 35, right?
Yeah, exactly. But Bob said, "I can't tell." He couldn't tell, between the 2. But it came out good.
If his ears can't hear it, there's not a human being that can't hear it. Maybe a dog somewhere.
I still get royalties off of Elvis Presley records.
So you actually acted as producer too. Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of the audience, are probably going to be, when your name is mentioned, I'm just going to say that a lot of the first things that come up, because it's when I fell in love with your work, was Dire Straits, Mark Knopfler area. Yeah. Those records are insane. And you and him, you and Mark developed 30 plus year now? Maybe?
It was about 30 years that we worked together. Yeah, I haven't done the last 2 albums that he's done. And
let's call it.
When we built British Grove, it was probably one of the best studios in the world. I kind of figured once that got built, that might be the end. But we carried on making records. It's just the economics of making records. Is So nowadays he's kind of got his staff that work at the studio, and his keyboard player, Guy Fletcher, is a great engineer anyhow. So he and Mark kind of build these records, the last couple. But beginning with Dire Straits, yeah, I got asked to come over and do the On Every Street album with Mark.
That's a great album.
And you know, he had gotten Paul Franklin, the steel player in town,
Yeah.
to like be involved with Dire Straits. He'd worked with Paul on a Chet Atkins record, that you know, that Neck to Neck album that Mark did, and so he was just asking Paul, who's great in Nashville, and Paul said, well, you should get Chuck.
Yeah.
People know him as Mr. Digital, and at the time, you know, Mark's was kind of known for his digital recording with Brothers in Arms. I mean, it basically launched the CD.
Yeah,
I think that
yeah,
album.
I remember that.
Yeah. So, but anyhow, I went over there and we like made this record for 7 months, and
Now, Bill Schnee had actually started the record,
he started
right?
the record,
Yeah.
and my understanding,
Another legend.
one of the greatest engineers ever. My understanding from Mark is that, you know, Bill had other projects that he had to
Makes
go
sense.
work on, and
Yeah.
Mark wanted somebody who could like stay throughout the project, and so they kind of parted ways after the first week, and that's when I came in.
Bill would have been one of the only engineers in the world at the time that would have not canceled everything on his calendar for Mark Knopfler. You know, it don't matter what I would have had. You know, my child's christening. Nope, Mike, I'm gonna be in London with Mark Knopfler.
Well, at the time, Dire Straits was like the biggest band in the world. They'd
Yeah.
had the biggest selling album ever. They had the biggest 2-year tour ever, and
Yeah.
all that. So, you know, when I got the phone call, I was working on this like album that nothing ever came of. It was a kind of a dance record, and we were behind schedule. And I got this phone call. That was back when you had a
Landline,
like a
yeah,
landline
yeah.
and a cord to the phone, you know.
Yeah.
And on the other end was this British sounding voice, and it's like, we'd like you to come work with Dire Straits. And I was like, oh, yeah, I figured it was one of my friends calling
yeah.
a prank, you know.
Yeah.
And I said, look, I'm really busy. You'll have to call back tomorrow. And I hung up on him. And so I get home, and my wife goes, so did Dire Straits management call you? And I go, I think I just screwed up royal.
Yeah.
But they actually called back, and maybe I got better pay because I.
It may be. It's like, well, he don't need it. He really doesn't need us.
Yeah.
This guy really is a big deal.
So, you know, when we were doing the Dire Straits record, Mark was like having kind of relationship problems with his wife. So he kind of wanted to stay out at the pub every night after work. And
Yeah.
so there was a local pub near Air Studios. This is back when Air was on Oxford Street, the original Air Studios, George Martin's place.
Yeah.
And so there was a pub around the corner where all the BBC people would turn up at, and it's called the George. So we go there every night, or I was staying in Notting Hill, and his house was not far from there. So there was another little pub there in Notting Hill that we'd go to, and they'd lock us in till all hours of the night. And, I remember one night coming home from the George, or coming back, we decided to go back to the studio. We were going to have a cup of coffee before going back to our hotels and whatnot. And we walk into the studio, and here all the assistants are sitting there jamming on Mark's, you know, Mark had all his guitars in there. They're playing on Mark's guitar, they're playing on Isley's bass, and the, you know, and Mark turns to me and he goes, you're going to have to do something about this, and walks out of the room.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, oh,
You
man.
get to be the principal for the school, huh?
God. You know, there's a lot of things I had to, like, you know, tell these kids off and make them feel really bad, which I hated doing.
Yeah.
But even worse than that, when I first started, when Bill was tracking with Mark, they had Jeff Picaro playing drums.
Oh.
And the first thing that I did was to have the guy who'd been been touring with Mark come in. And I mean, the drums, he hadn't played drums since the tour, which it was like 3 years previous. And the drums turn up and they're all still in plastic, you know, and all that. And I set them up and all that. And he comes in, for like a week of tracking, I had to sit there and tell him that it's not happening. So we didn't get anything that first week. And at the weekend, I go back to the hotel and I go, oh, well, I'm probably gonna get fired, you know, and all this. And I come back
Breaking
in.
up the
I come
band.
back in on Monday, and they had fired the drummer, and so we carried on, you know.
Yeah. You're kind of playing the Yoko Ono role.
I know. It was like,
Breaking up the band.
but Mark, at any rate, the pub thing. Mark and I would go to the pub, and we'd sit there and we'd talk about making records. And he goes, you know, after this album, there's not going to be another Dire Straits. I mean, we're done. He said, but I'll probably do some solo stuff, and how would you do it? And so we started talking, and you know, after the tour and all that for On Every Street, I didn't hear anything. About 3 years later, I get a phone call from Mark, and he goes, hey man, I want to come to Nashville and track some stuff for my record. And that's what started it all up. You know, it's like,
so British Grove didn't exist at that time.
no, we would, what we did, well, that was the last record I did at Air Studios when it was on Oxford Street. And so when we started his solo stuff, they had built a new studio, the Lyndhurst Hall Studios. And so I was the first person in there, in all the rooms, really. I was the first person in the big orchestra room, and then first person in Studio One, and the first person in Studio 3, the mix studio. So with Mark,
Wow,
that's an incredible place. It's just unbelievable.
Those records, you know, I mean, they're iconic. You know, I mean, starting with Golden Heart was. I still think every time I listen to Golden Heart or The Fool I Never Thought I Was, I don't remember the exact title of it. I think when it gets to the solo, I think I cry just a little bit each time I hear it. You know, it's his playing is, you know, just so emotional. I mean, do you remember much about capturing that you know, those guitar solos?
Well, yes. I mean, Mark, I mean, he's an unbelievable guitar player, but he's also, he wants things to be, you know, the way he wants them to be, right? I'm not going to say perfect, because that's not how he is. But he wants them the way he wants them to be. So he would like his amplifiers always sort of like isolated, so that it wouldn't like have bleed in the room, and he wouldn't be able to replace or redo. And how he really preferred to work was, you know, we get the rhythm track or whatever, but then he'd like to do all of his solos after everything was on the record. Like, so, you know, he wanted vocals, background vocals. He wanted, you know, the whole production built up on before he'd play his solos, because he wanted to respond to everything. Rather, you know, I mean, there's two ways to look at that. You know, if you have the solo, like when I'm working with Peter Frampton, I like him to play live and get the solos with the band, because everybody responds to that. But Mark, I mean, he has the whole, I think he sees the whole finished thing in his head. And we just work to try and achieve that. And so he likes to play solos after everything's on the record, and he likes to be in the control room where he can hear the record the way it sounds, not in headphones. He doesn't want to be out there getting blasted by the guitar amp. You know, he wants. So we had this whole way of working. And he's also, I mean, he doesn't use like pedals.
Right.
You know,
That's not his deal.
No, it's his fingers. You know, it's his fingers, and he would use a volume pedal from time to time, but really it's his fingers and the guitar and the amp. So we end up, he's got all these incredible guitars, you know, I mean, great Les Pauls, great Strats, great, you know, Pensas, all whatever. So he'd think about what he wanted to achieve, and we'd have half a dozen guitars in the control room, and we'd set up several amps, and he'd pick up a guitar, and we'd play. I'd get a sound on the amp out in the room and come back in, and if he didn't like that, he'd say, you know, give me another one, and so until he found the guitar that he liked. But I'd be sitting there where you are, and he'd be sitting here.
Oh man.
And so I got to sit there with Mark and just hear this come out of his fingers. It's just the most incredible thing.
Yeah.
I learned so much working with Mark, because he's, you know, he said, you know, in Nashville, you guys make records that sound like other records are on the radio. He said, I've never ever made a record to be on the radio. He said, I just write these songs and I make records that suit the song. Because I kind of came up in Nashville, this whole sort of machinery that we have here, it's amazing.
Oh,
I mean,
it is.
it's amazing.
Nothing like it.
Nothing like it in the world. But it also tends to like kind of get stagnated in this sort of like kind of do it this way and knock it out and boom. You know, it's kind of feels like it's manufactured and not performed or not, you know. So I mean, I learned so much from being around Mark. Yeah,
that's incredible. I can't imagine being in the room with him while some of that, you know, and really something I've always, you know, admired about those productions and you and your team, your engineering team, is I think a lot of, if those were being done today by somebody that had just gotten out of Full Sail, what's the first thing they're going to do with Mark's incredible solos? Probably try to pocket it, you know, because part of the emotion of his work is rushing and being behind. I mean, that's what's tugging at the heart, you know. And you guys, you know, what went to tape just sounds like that's what came out. It's because that's what was in his heart, you know. It's not technically perfect, but it's perfect.
Yeah.
You know, because of that.
And that was something that, you know, he also really taught me, is that, you know, being a little bit in front of the you know, beat makes it have this intensity.
Yeah.
It's like, it feels like it's urgent. And he said, if you like get everything locked in, it just gets boring.
Yeah.
I mean, I learned that lesson so well. What would happen is, because in the early, like when we did the Dire Straits record, we had the Synclavier direct-to-disc system. This is before Pro Tools or any of these hard disk editing systems was that. And it actually sounded really good. And I mean, we'd do crazy stuff like, you know, changing notes and moving beats and all that sort of stuff. You say it sounds really natural, but a lot of those records are really worked on to make them sound like that.
Yeah.
And, but during, I think it was probably the Sailing to Philadelphia album, I remember we had cut this track and we'd taken, the way we'd do the early albums was we'd record in Nashville and then we'd go to England. He had a couple of homes on this Mews in Holland Park, and one of them I would stay in, and the other one on the other side of the Mews is where his studio was. And we'd do like all the overdubs and fixing and things like that there. And I remember we were using Pro Tools by this time, and Guy Fletcher was kind of the Pro Tools operator, and I was like sitting there going, oh, we need to move this here, move that there, you know. And we got this track so perfect and everything, and we thought we'd just done all this killer work. And I remember going home for the holidays and couldn't wait to like put the CD in the car and crank it up, you know. And I was like, God, we destroyed it. So we had to go back and undo all that, you know.
That bites. But gosh, it's just fantastic. Sailing to Philadelphia, was that one of your Grammy wins?
No. I got a Grammy with Mark for doing the remix of Brothers in Arms for the at that time it was 5-1 for the Surround Grammy. But no, we didn't get one, but it was a big hit album. I mean, that was you know, that song in particular James Taylor sang on. And but yeah, a lot of cool stuff with Mark. I mean, also on that album we had Van Morrison sing on a song. And I remember we had tracked in Nashville, and we flew to England, and Van was the first thing. I mean, we literally left Nashville, got to the airport in London, Mark had his assistant had dropped off his car at the airport. We got in the car, drove to Bath, which is where Van's studio was. And we'd had a Sony 3348 delivered, and so anyhow, you know, Van is kind of notorious for not like, you know, talking to anybody except for who he wants to talk to. So they had like lunch set up for me, Mark, and Van. And I remember sitting there at the table and Van's talking to Mark, and I could have been a fly on the wall, you know. I mean, he totally ignored me, and I kind of got the vibe, so I left the there and walked around the garden for a while. But Van's also notorious for only singing it once. So we had this 3348 sent over there, and everything's set up, and the control room at that studio was actually upstairs, and there wasn't a window looking into the studio. So I get on the phone. Well, actually, we wait for the phone to ring, and it's Van. He goes, "Okay, I'm ready," and I go, "Okay." So here we'll start rolling tape, and I remember there was a window in the control room, and Mark was just gazing out the window, just like absorbing what was going on. It was so incredible. I mean, Van's vocal was just unbelievable, and like right in the middle of the verse, the engineer stops the machine, and I go, "What?" He goes, "It was in rehearse. It wasn't recording." And so Mark goes, "Well, you got to talk to Van."
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
I get on the phone. I go, "Van, we had a technical problem up here, and we didn't actually get that." And the phone's just silent on the other end. And basically it just hangs up.
Oh, man.
And I'm going, oh. So I go to the engineer. He said, "Well, he only does it, only sings it once. Give him a minute."
Calm down.
So really it was like a half hour. We're just sitting there. And then the phone rings, and it's, "Okay, I'm ready to go again."
Yeah, wow.
So we get that vocal. It's great. I mean, it's great. If you've heard the song, it sounds unbelievable, but it wasn't that first take.
Yeah.
And
that's a good lesson for everyone that's watching. The red button, make sure that always arm the track. Yeah, right.
Well, and Peter Frampton's the same way. I mean, it's like that first pass on guitar is the one.
Yeah.
And so you get that, and then you fix it. If there's something that's not quite right.
So you're one of those lucky guys. All us guitar fans. You've been in the room with all those instruments. I mean, the Peter Frampton iconic guitars and drums from that tour.
Yeah. In here.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. And the story of the Phoenix guitar. I didn't even know that. Here, I'm a Peter Frampton fan. I don't know how I didn't know that. But,
the guitar that was on Comes Alive, on the cover of Comes Alive, that actually was on an airplane that went down and was thought to have burnt up. And
wow.
Peter got it back a few years ago. Whoever had pulled it out of the ashes had just kept it for, I don't know, it was 20 years or something like that, and had taken it in to get it repaired, and the repair person identified it and asked Peter, "Is this your guitar?" And Peter described his guitar, because he had done stuff like hollowed out inside behind the pickups and things like that, and made the body skinnier than a normal Les Paul. And so anyhow, the guitar came back to Peter. It was just like
as it should.
As it should.
Yeah.
And when Peter plays that, man, he plays different.
What's your you just talked about some of your takeaways from working and lessons, just to make you better as a producer, as an engineer, that you got from Mark. What's something? Can you think of something that Peter has you've gained from working with Peter?
Well, just great friendship, we talk almost every day. He lives in Nashville here, and he's a techie. I mean, he's more of a gearhead than I am, really. I mean, we like our gear, right?
Yeah, It's
so nice
this wall
about
behind me.
Yeah, that wall. Right,
I don't want to look over there because I'll probably, I'll start shaking.
But Peter always says to me, he said, "Man, I hate it when you come over here, Chuck." He said, "I always end up having to buy something."
Yeah.
I'll bring something new, and he's like, "Oh wow, what's that?" I'll tell him what it is. He goes, "Oh wow, how can I get one of those?"
Yeah. What vocal mic does he use?
Mostly we use either a 47. He's got a really great 47, but he's also got when he first left Humble Pie and started his solo career, he went out and bought two 67s, and he bought two 1176s, a couple of those 1176s over there.
Wow.
And these two 67s, which are in the closet back there, and they're amazing. I mean, he had when Stephen Paul was the guy, no longer with us, but he had Steve. It was kind of the thing you did out in LA was have Stephen Paul mod your 67. So he's got 2 of those, and unbelievable sounding. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. So many records. Okay, here's a fun thing, because you were doing some of this when we were sharing space, not sharing space, but working out of the same building at Soundstage. You were doing George Strait records. Okay,
Yeah.
so we've talked about Peter Frampton. We've talked about Mark Knopfler. Another one of the world's most amazing guitar players on the planet is Brent Mason. We're lucky enough to own him right here in Nashville.
Yeah.
And so you've worked with Brent, I know, a lot. As I've been really, really lucky. So he did a lot of those sessions, right?
Oh man, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I
he was,
always have
yeah.
Brent on. You can't do a George Strait record without Brent Mason.
Right. So let's talk about some of those recording sessions, because they were extremely unique, because you didn't necessarily do them in a comfortable little studio in Nashville or in London or somewhere else. Tell us some about your excursions to the Caribbean.
I started doing George Strait records like way back when Jimmy Bowen was producing in Nashville, and then Tony Brown started producing George. I think the first album that Tony did was the Pure Country album. It was a massive one. It was the movie. There was the movie and that George was in and all that. So, and that we did at Soundstage and Front Stage. But then, Tony wanted to do something kind of more adventurous, and he'd heard about somebody going down to Jimmy Buffett's studio in Key West, and he said, "Do you think you can make that work?" And I go, "Well, let me check it out."
'Cause that's a big band.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we've got 3 guitar players, fiddle, steel, piano, 2 keyboard players, bass, drums, and then George, of course. And the studio isn't a whole lot bigger than this down there. I mean, it's not a whole lot bigger than this control room. And it's got one booth that we'd like stick the acoustic guitar in, and one booth in the other corner where we'd stick the fiddle, and then a booth just off the control room where George would be. But everybody else was in the studio. And of course, I mean, 2 electric guitar amps just blasting in the room, and piano and all that. So what we'd do is we'd have a cartage truck drive down to Key West with all the gear from here in Nashville, all the, drums, guitar amps, whatever. And after we'd unload that and put all the, set up all the guys in their spots in the room, I would take baffles and create like sections for the steel amp and the 2 electric guitar amps, and so in the truck that's sitting outside of the studio, that's where the amps would go. And Key West is like, it's just full of tourists, right? And this is like the studio's right there on the docks. And part of the reason we go there is George has it's like 100-foot fishing yacht. I mean, it's like,
nice.
It's not really a fishing boat.
I wouldn't call it a dinghy.
It's something else. It's beautiful. But he'd stay on his boat and then just walk to the studio and record, and then go back to his boat, whatever. So the tourists are walking up and down this sort of Broadway or Broadwalk outside of the studio, and here's all these like people just rock it out, and they. Like one time George was sitting outside, they had like just a little folding chair outside the door to the studio, and George was sitting there, and George is so unassuming, if he doesn't have his cowboy hat on and all that, you wouldn't know that's George Strait. Right. He had a baseball cap on, he's sitting out there, and some of the tourists come up to him, and they'd heard all this going on in the truck, and wondering what's going on. And they knew that was Buffett's studio. All those parrot heads know
it's well
that
known.
So, is he in there? And George, oh no, it's just some country guy from Nashville.
They're actually
they don't know they're talking to George Strait.
Oh my
right?
gosh, one of the biggest legends of country music, and that's funny.
Yeah, they don't call him the king of country for nothing.
But the challenges of getting that captured in there, it just sounds like it had to be a logistical nightmare for you and your team.
We kind of have it worked out now. It's they've actually got an incredible console in there. It's an old 8068 Neve, and it's like my favorite console on the planet as far as recording. And then I take my racks of gear down there. So we have channels, and you just don't. you know not to go too far with doing anything. You just
Right,
get it recorded and
Yeah.
but there's something about the piano in the same room with the drums. Of course, we kind of blanket it off and to get some isolation, but that leakage actually makes the drums sound bigger. And especially in like a small room like that, it's not like you're going to have room mics everywhere,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
the ceilings, like you almost bump your head into the air conditioning ducts walking in there, but it, uh, and I just did a record with Ann Wilson from Heart
Yeah.
down in at Fame in Muscle Shoals. Same deal. I mean, we basically, the drums are here. There's a baffle and the piano's there, and it sounded amazing.
Yeah.
It's something, I mean, a lot of younger people are used to the more modern studio where everything's all isolated, so you don't have, no bleed from anything into anything,
Right,
and actually bleed is what makes things kind of gel,
So you're not you're not against cutting old school if you need to do it.
No,
Then.
and at times, I was like, I'll bring the bass amp into the studio area and the guitar amp and just let it bleed into sort of the room mics and the drum mics and everything. And it kind of, like I said, it kind of helps everything kind of blend together. When we designed Knopfler's British Grove studio, we built it so that all the booths have sliding glass or sliding walls, so you can like open all the booths up, and so you can be all in one room if you want, or if you need the isolation, you can close the booth.
That's incredible.
So, yeah.
And you carried that, what you had learned from that, you carried that back to the United States with you at Soundstage.
Yeah, so when I got to redo my room at Soundstage, I wanted to have a studio that could do all kinds of music. So if you needed the isolation, you could like have booths, but if you wanted it kind of everybody in the same room, you could open up the big wall. And so, yeah, I mean, and another thing about that studio is one of my favorite drum rooms was the old A&M studios in LA, and it had concrete floors. So when I did Backstage, I did concrete floors in there too. So yeah,
that was quite the construction process. The broken window, the glass walls that would get broken on delivery. Oh my gosh, that was quite a process. So, if you think about George Strait, I mean, you have to think a little bit about those guitar tones that you got with Brent Mason.
Oh, well, Brent is just, at one time, I think there was, he played the solo on all but like 2 songs that were #1 on the radio that year. I mean, he literally,
he was that dominant.
He was that dominant.
Yeah.
I remember he was in a little cover band that played at this, it was like a steakhouse, and downstairs they had a band, and you square dance to whatever. And I remember going down there to hear him play. He was just unbelievable. That was before he kind of broke into the session scene.
And he was really young.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That story that everyone swears is true, about I think it was that place when there was a guy that had a little too much drink and was feeling his oats a little too much.
Oh yeah.
And do you know that story?
Yeah, go ahead and tell it.
He wanted to set in with the band, but they were like, yeah, we don't really do that kind of thing. But then through the night, different session musicians would get done with their 6 o'clock, and they would filter in, and they would of course be asked to set in because everybody knew everybody. And the guy that had too much to drink got mad and went up to the stage. He said, "I'll just have you know," and he started pointing at each of them. I'm better than you. I'm better than you. I'm better than you. And he got to Brent and said, and skipped and skipped over him. It's like he knew. It's like, dude, you don't tug Superman's cape. You just don't. Everyone in the room swears it's true, but Brent's always like, nah. He's kind of humble. He's just like, no, I don't. That didn't really happen.
He kind of comes off as sort of a badass too. Like, you don't want to mess with this guy. And I was always afraid of him. But
it's quiet.
When you get around him, and he's actually a real sweetheart. Yeah.
So what's your secret to capturing Brent Mason? What's your go-to?
Let him do the thing. I mean,
just let him be Brent.
I mean, for years, it was just put a 57 in front of the cabinet, you know,
Nothing wrong with that.
and there you go.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think now I still just put a 57 and I'm at a you know, a Royer 121 on there, and that's kind of...
On your 57, are you, you know, like here's the center of the cone, here's the edge of the speaker, you straight on in one of those spots, you kind of angled a little for mellowness?
You know, I've messed around with it prior to using the Royer. I always kind of had found that, you know, if you put the microphone off the center, kind of not at the edge, but kind of, and put it at a 45 degree, that you kind of, you know, pointing in towards the dust cone, that was the thing. And, you know, I mean, depending on how far away from, you know, the speaker, you get a little warmer, or pull it out, it get a little, you know, more open sound. So I kind of got my distance. A lot of times it's like, get as close as you can, you know, I mean, without touching the grill cloth. But, and then I just sort of experimented with the 121 to add to that. And, you know, it was really John Jennings from Royer who, he, you know, he, like you, he kind of liked my work, and he came up to me and he said, man, you ought to try out my ribbon mic. And he said, try it with a 57 on a guitar amp. So I did, and that was the deal, you know, I mean, but I tend to put them as close as I can get them, you know, so that you don't get any phase cancellation between the two mics. And I always put the ribbon more towards the dust cone, because it's a little warmer sounding. And that's kind of the deal.
What preamps are you going to throw on it?
Man, for me, electric guitar, it's an API, you know, so I mean, I just always a couple of API pre's.
Probably no EQ on Brent whatsoever.
No, I never. You know, that's another thing. I don't EQ and I don't compress electric guitars, and that's something I got from, you know, maybe in the mix, but that's something I got from Knopfler. Was, you know, I mean, I think I put an 1176 on him the first time I started working with him. He goes, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, you know, just what we do in Nashville." And he goes, "No, you're just taking away what I do. When you know, when I play harder, it just doesn't get harder. So, you know, get rid of that thing, you know." So now I don't do that.
Right. You know, what I think I learned a lot about what not to do, you know, as much as I did what to do by hanging out with musicians. You know, in Nashville, we're lucky enough, because we do work in big groups a lot of times. You go out to lunch and you hear the guys talk about what was great the day before. You know, when they worked with Chuck Ainlay, and they're like, "Dude, that's legit, man." You know, and I remember Mark Hill talking about you that way. He's legit. But anyway, you remember, you know, Mark. But you know, but you can also learn what not to do. You know, because you hear them gripe about, "Man, I hate cutting in that place or with that guy because of this," and over EQ. You know, electric guitar players want to hear their amp. They know what their tone knobs, you know, and their amp is doing. And if you mess with that, they're not happy, you know, and a lot of guys don't know that, you know, and compression, acoustic guitar players, piano players, like, I'm playing at a dynamic, at a certain dynamic, because I want to play at that certain dynamic, and I want to hear that dynamic. If you're squishing me, it's not, you know.
Yeah, you know, there's time and place for everything. So sometimes you want that real compressed acoustic guitar, and you go, "Look, I want to go for this thing," and they'll go with you. But, you know, yeah, you're right. It's like, for the most part, you know, you're taking away the performance when you start doing that. So, you know, I mean,
we can save that for...
Well, and you can, if you want to hear it, you can always, like, monitor it, you know. You don't have to commit to it. That being said, you know, there's a lot of times, like I said, that it's appropriate to go for a compression thing, and I like to commit to those kinds of things. I don't...
When you and the musician agree on it, it's like,
and it, you know, it's a creative decision at that point. It's not just you want to make it loud. It's a creative decision.
Right, exactly. I just touched this bad boy. This is Peter's 4000, all E. I think we talked about the EQ models are all E's, right?
Yeah, it's all E's. We when he bought this studio, he'd had a studio up in Cincinnati, at his house in Cincinnati, and when he and his wife got divorced, he moved back to Nashville and was needing a studio, and the producer, Richard Landis, who initially built this place, this console was in here. Unbelievably, I'm sorry about my watch.
That's okay. You're Chuck Ainlay. You're in demand.
I had muted it. Unbelievably, somebody bought a house in Cincinnati that wanted a recording studio and a big SSL. So, Peter lucked out in that way. But this console was not in as good a shape as his one up there. And so we had it all recapped. It's totally perfect.
Yeah.
The automation works and everything. I love it.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Now, when I think of you, one thing I think of is SSL. You have a long-standing relationship with our friends.
Like I said, I had the first SSL in Nashville.
Wow.
And SSL was although I mean there were people that would hire me and make me work on a Neve because they thought my record sounded better when I worked on Neves. Heck, I don't care.
Yeah, right. If the check clears,
yeah,
I'll do it.
That's right. But so, and then when I took over the backstage room at Soundstage, Tony Brown, another producer that I'd done a lot with over the years, he was the president of Universal by then. And he came back from their corporate meeting and he said, okay, from now on, we're going to have to start doing all the records in 5.1 as well as stereo. So, well, I had in my head, the only way you're going to do that, and budget-wise and everything, is be able to do the stereo and the 5.1 mix simultaneously. Mm-hmm. And it'd be difficult to do on an analog desk. So SSL had this new digital console. It was called the Axiom. And I got talked into buying it. Oh man, was that a mistake?
I mean, they looked a lot like a.
It looked a lot like the 9000 in a lot of ways, and
it was in the 90s, right? Mid 90s.
Yeah, late-ish 90s, and it was I liked it, but it had the limitation of only working at 48K, and also at the same time that 5.1 was happening. DVD audio, which had, was coming out, and SACD, and so the spec for DVD audio was 96K. So all of a sudden, the Axiom was becoming obsolete.
Pretty quick, then.
Quick. And I had George Massenburg come in to do a record in the studio, and he griped and moaned, and part of it was because he had been involved in designing the EQ for the Sony Oxford console.
Oh, right.
So he was like, he's so smart.
Oh yeah.
But he griped so much, and the word kind of got out that he didn't like the Axiom, and so I was taking a beating. I paid a lot of money for that thing, right?
Yeah.
So at any rate, Don Wershpa at SSL is such a sweet man. He's no longer with them, but he helped me get out of that, and I got a 9000 after that. So much, for many years, then I worked on the 9000. And when Peter asked me to come over here, and getting back on the 4000, it was just like, it was like coming home. I was like, man, I can just dial it in like that,
Crank that top band if you want to.
I knew exactly what to do on this thing. So it's a great desk. I love it.
Now, when you worked on the 9000, because, there's always that debate. When you work on a 9000, you can engage the E-Series EQ or the, I don't know if it's the G that it comes, whatever it comes with, Right. Which did you prefer?
It depends.
Yeah. So you did use that button?
I wouldn't engage the E all that much because it really didn't sound like an EEQ to me. But,
well, the frequency response was completely different, wasn't it? Yeah.
So, and I like the 9000. It's a more open sounding console. It's hard. Yeah. The thing about the 4000, you can kind of drive it hard, and it sounds better.
Yeah.
It doesn't really idle very good. Whereas the 9000, if you drive it hard, it kind of just doesn't sound good. It kind of gets crispy, but it does idle very good.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like, you kind of, to make those pretty records, which I like making pretty records as much as I like making records that are smashed, the 9000's maybe a little better console. Yeah. I for years, though, I mean, everybody's kind of gone to mixing at home, mixing in the computer, I stayed away from it. I just didn't understand it. It's like, man, I like what an analog console does, to the sound, and I like the being so intuitive, knowing where to reach and turning the knob without looking at anything, just using your ears. That part about mixing on an analog console, I love. But then we had recently had, you know, everybody locked in, and I had to figure out how to keep making records. And so now I'm like mixing at home. I love it. My speakers sound better than any professionally designed control room I've ever been in my life. And
you're an ATC guy.
Well, I'm an ATC guy. I have these custom-made speakers at home. They have a 300-watt Class A power amp, threshold power amp on them, and it was made by this kind of esoteric audio company, which actually doesn't exist any longer. They're Nova, and these things sound amazing. So I've got my room set up to mix Atmos.
There you go.
So I have 7 of the Novas, and then I'm using JBLs for the height speakers.
You know, something I'll share with you, speaking of SSL, I've been working a lot on a duality recently.
Yeah.
And that's a whole different animal too, but
Yeah.
I love the thing. But because I'm such an SSL junkie for my mix room at home, I recently got their fader pack and the UC1. Because if you're an SSL guy, you have those hands-on like we remember, you know.
I gotta have a fader. I gotta be able to move faders, and I did the exact same thing. I have a couple of the fader packs, and then the
UL8 maybe UF8
UF8,
and the UC1.
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
It's awesome.
I remember. I mean, for a long time, I remember you had the Nuendo controller.
Yes, I use Nuendo. I'm back in the day when everybody switched over to hard disks, I kind of stayed on the Sony 3348. Because Pro Tools sounded so bad. I mean, it was terrible. I was like, how can you sacrifice the audio quality for the convenience of nonlinear? And now I get it. I get the nonlinear thing, but I never understood why you'd sacrifice audio quality. So I was told about, ask if I would join this group of producers that were going to sort of endorse Nuendo. This was, version 1 on a PC that could barely run it, right? So it was always crashing. But you could use. I got these like incredible converters. It sounded great. It was, 32-bit floating point. It didn't have all the sort of audio problems that
those black-faced converters.
I mean, I hate to down anything.
No,
but
they've come a long way.
Yeah, Pro Tools sounds great now. But I just, from years and years of using Nuendo, I feel like I have my hands tied behind my back, and I'm pushing the fader or the mouse with my nose. And also now, like Nuendo has the built-in renderer for Atmos, and so it's just there's just things about Nuendo to me are far superior. And nobody tells me what kind of software I have to work on. I mean, I guess because I'm who I am, but I just say that because you don't have to use Pro Tools.
Whatever works for you. I mean, they all do. At the end of the day, we all are trying to get to the same spot. Whatever road we have to take is what road we have to take. But now on your, you have the UC1, or are you using some of the SSL channel strips so you can have hands-on?
Yeah, and again, I mean, I'm kind of lucky that, manufacturers like to say that I use their stuff. So I was out to dinner with Phil Wagner, who's the president of SSL, and he said, man, you ought to try out some of my plugins. And so anyhow, I love all their stuff. It's like, the channel strip is like awesome, and it doesn't like take up a lot of processing power. So a lot of projects, I'll just like put the channel strip on everything, and then having that controller allows it to feel kind of like you're mixing on an analog desk. You've got everything kind of at your fingertips.
Right. I've had so many years with a mouse. I've had hand problems. And so I literally bought it. It's like I have to offload some of this mouse activity to real knobs. I mean, I already had a fader pack, but I need some real knobs again. So and there's lots of SSL sounding plugins out there that are amazing. But
Yeah, I
I've
had
got
to get off the mouse too. I was getting this massive callus right here just from all day long,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
so now I use
exactly.
a trackball, but you're right. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm really enjoying. I'm very much enjoying it. I will say, thinking back about country music and its evolution, for as a genre. I mean, there was a time, I'm going to say in the mid '90s. I'm trying to think of when radio was turned on its end by a band of three women named the Dixie Chicks,
yeah.
and all of a sudden, our modern, at that time, radio sound got turned on its end by bluegrass, like coming back. And you were,
Banjo.
yeah. What's a banjo?
Banjo and fiddle.
You were a big part of that, as I recall.
Well, I got to record the first couple albums, and I mixed the first three. But
Which were the good ones? Let's just
okay.
say. Those are the great ones.
Yeah, so that was Blake Chansey, who producer in town. He was at RCA at the time, and Paul Worley were the two producers on those records. And Blake and I had done tons of work together over the years, and we're good pals. We like to go to the lake, and we always had that in common. But yeah, so I remember that first album we recorded in Backstage, my studio when it was
much
little.
small.
Yeah. And I remember mixing that first record, and I was just doing my sort of normal thing to it, put a little bit of reverb here and there and all that, a little delay on the vocal and all that stuff, and thought I had it sounding really great, and they came in to hear the first song, and I go, oh no, turn all that reverb off. I want it completely 100% dry. And so that's what we did. I mean,
Which
I mean,
was
I
not
think
radio at that time, was
no,
it? Yeah.
I mean, how wet, country records were, and this was like you say, it kind of really was 180 degrees in the way record ought to sound,
Yeah.
So I'll take credit for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there was Dixie Chicks. I got to do Taylor Swift's first few albums,
Yeah.
and I remember mixing her first one, and I think she was like 16 years old when she came in and sat behind the console, and I remember her sitting at the console, and I had kind of done a thing that I thought was more, I mean, we'd call it Americana now, but it's like kind of a more upfront and personal kind of leave the flaws kind of mix, And I thought that because, I mean, her voice wasn't exactly developed at that time, but she had an interesting voice, and
It was compelling.
yeah. So, but I remember her sitting at the console, and like, I would have been so intimidated because this was the Masterphonics mix room, massive console, massive control room.
Was that the blue SSL?
No, this is
a
before
different-
that, but
okay.
it was a big SSL, and big speakers, everything, And she was not intimidated one iota, and just kind of turned to me and like had some comments about the mix that made sense, and I made the adjustments for her, and but I thought I was very impressed by that, her being that age and being, having that kind of grown up sort of style about her. I've gotten to be involved with a lot of things at the beginning, like Steve Earle's first albums, and so Steve, when he was young, was pretty wild.
That record was a game changer too.
Yeah, and I mean, Guitar Town was again a really big record. I mean, I don't think it did but gold, but it was so different. And I remember Steve like smoked cigarettes like crazy, and I smoked cigarettes too. And I'd always have to buy an extra pack of cigarettes, just because Steve would always be bumming them. I mean, it's like, okay, well, here you go, Steve. But I remember that album, Guitar Town, we were mixing it out at the Castle, my old studio, and he came in one day. It was like in late or early in the morning, you might say. And he'd been rocking. He had a couple of bottles of Jägermeister, had just finished a bottle and was starting in on the second bottle of Jägermeister, and he's sitting there listening to the mix, and all of a sudden he just goes, ugh. Knobs indented into his forehead.
Yeah.
And we just left him there, and we took his Jägermeister and finished the bottle for him. But yeah, he was a bit of a nut. I remember one time him coming in, and there was I was doing another, I think it was the second album, and he just like, he pulled the gun out and he's like, slams the gun down on the console and goes, all right, let's hear this shit. And I was like, oh,
Yeah,
it better be good.
I didn't have my bulletproof vest
Yeah,
on.
no, like,
You brought up something though that I'll touch on real briefly, because you were the first person that I ever noticed doing it. It was on a George Strait mix. You used to allow me to come in at the end of the day and hear some of stuff that hadn't been released yet. Which what an honor to hear George Strait stuff that hadn't been released. But you were one of the first that I had seen, because the guy I came up under. This was my snare reverb, right? This is my primary lead vocal. Maybe he had 2 reverbs on the lead vocal, but that's all they hit. Hey, this is for other instruments in the band. You were kind of a hey, these are the reverbs I'm using, and I'm going to send a little splash of stuff all over the place.
yeah, it's kind of what I developed, was like a way of kind of, well, partially is to try and like make everything gel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if they're all in a different place sonically, then they don't feel like they're together musically,
it makes sense,
and so it was kind of like, but some things required a bit more plate, and some things a bit more hall, whatever, and so yeah, that's kind of what I do.
So I mean, but you would use some of the reverbs that were on vocals were also hitting other instruments,
Right.
and vice versa, or drums, or whatever the
kind
case.
of like to try and put everybody in the same place, and same thing.
I remember, and you used a lot of channel strip, not a heavy compression, but you like the channel strip compressors in an SSL. I remember that.
Yeah. Like, and I won't, like, some people I'll sit there and see the
the LED.
all the lights lighting up, and I like don't do that, but
Right.
yeah, it's
I love the channel strip compressor.
well, I mean, there's a lot of people just put something on the 2 mix and just smash the record and glue it together. But I kind of feel like, compression is like a creative thing. If you're using compression, you ought to hear it, and you ought to, because it is adding to the musicality.
Right.
So that's kind of the way I use compression.
Yeah. It's well, your records have a distinctive sound. That's for sure.
Hope that's a good thing.
It is. It's a very good thing. Obviously, how many years have you been employed, gainfully employed?
Well, yeah. But one thing that you and I are both very fortunate is that we came up in a time where we were allowed to go into studios with musicians and, make an album.
Yeah.
Like you actually like make an album, like,
Right.
and so you'd spend weeks recording and months with the artist, kind of like, engaging in this process where, the artist is, basically bearing their soul, and you're there kind of absorbing all this creativity, or helping in the process, whatever.
Yeah.
And so many people now are making records, one part at a time, and it's like, it's one person, basically one person's idea, really. They're playing all the parts on a keyboard or whatever, I mean, and it's all plugins, and so I mean, we're just very lucky, and there's something about these studios that are magical to me. And
Agreed.
and I would just say, if you have the opportunity to use a studio and hire a group of musicians, do it, because it's one of the most fun things about recording is that time.
Yeah, it really
it's
is.
My favorite bit is.
As long as I've been doing this, and you'd probably say the same thing, and no matter how much level of whatever esteem prestige you achieve in this chair on this side, I'm still inspired when I go into a recording session by what's going on out there. The level of musicianship that we have in this town, the drummers, the guitar players. they amp me up. It's like
Yeah.
I want to be as good in here as they are out there. Like
Yeah.
it's like we feed off of each other. The energy is just, when people, the guitar player, hey, I got an idea right here, and the piano player, like I'm going to jump on the back half of that for the turnaround. Play it in a different octave or whatever. It's just the creativity that goes on in rooms like this is unbelievable.
And I mean, you know it as well that those people on the other side of the glass are your best friend.
Yeah.
And you have to treat them super special. It's don't have an ego as an engineer, really. I mean, you just absorb it, and be part of it and work with the people on the other side of the glass. They're your best friend, and they'll cover for you when you've got problems. If you cover for them when they've got problems, don't sell them out. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
and I said it earlier. I literally, I think I have learned as much about my craft from them in terms of comments or advice as I have other engineers.
Yeah.
Their influence is irreplaceable.
I mean, the most common question you get asked by young people is, how do I get into the business? And for me, I'd say, well, find some musicians and just like help them out. Do whatever you can, because as you guys grow you're going to end up finding that those people are going to be the ones on the other side of the glass and that, I mean, at least it was that way for me, I mean, I kind of found a band and latched onto them and helped them like in their, their little bar gigs that they were doing, and it was like, now they're like the top studio musicians, and it's like this camaraderie that just goes on, and so they're my favorite people in the world as musicians. So
Agreed.
Yeah, that and my wife.
Yeah, exactly. So I remember just a shout out to you and your character. When I was at Soundstage at the same time as you, my microphone locker was somewhat disappointing compared to yours. It's like you had. In fact, I tried to copy your system of the Gator, or not the Gator, the big cases with the handles, and things. So when I was like, man, I kind of need a 67 sound. I need a 251. I'd mosey back there, and I was always embarrassed, be like, hey Chuck, what do you think about letting me use that 251? He's just, go get it, man. Just go get it. You always were great, but you're. I picked up a lot of things, from you walking through the room at the, you were always so open. I learned about Audio-Technica headphones, the M50s. I remember you always had the room you had your own custom pair and your own color code.
Yeah, well, the Audio-Technica has been unbelievably great with me. I mean, and I love their products. The headphones, everybody seems to use them now. I mean, at the time, there was a lot of different things around, but
you were the first that
the cool thing about those is almost anything can drive them, and they sound great, and they've good isolation, and they stand up. I mean, they don't break too easily, and so I love those. Their microphones, you mentioned Blackbird Studios, so John McBride, he's probably amassed the greatest mic collection of any studio or any private collector. In fact, we're doing something over there this coming weekend, and I said, can you send me a mic list? And they said, well, we don't really keep a mic list because he's always buying and selling the mics. It'd be irrelevant. But I mean, he's got like 25 C12s, 25 67. I mean, there's just drawers of incredible microphones. But what always pisses him off is like, I put up all my Audio-Technicas, and I don't use those things. Really.
I remember, in addition to the M50s, which everybody uses now, and like I said, you were the first. Everybody had the old falling apart Fostex T40s. Remember those? They were great, but they were by that time held together by duct tape. But you had those. Is it the 50 series microphones that I still have yet to hear? I know they sent you some of those.
Yeah. So there's the 5045s. That's sort of what they call their small diaphragm, but it's a rectangular the engineer, he's really, kind of come up with something really amazing. But it's a rectangular capsule, and he says it's actually got a lot less distortion because the surface area, it's got as much surface area, but not as much that's like in a round diaphragm. You have more area that's not like that can move and distort, whatever. Anyhow, it's lower distortion. And then there's the 5047 and the 5040, I believe, is what they call their larger, more like vocal microphone kind of thing. I love the 5047 on a female vocal. It sounds amazing.
I'm gonna have to give the
Yeah.
I haven't borrowed mics from you in a long time. I may have to come
totally,
back and knock on the door
totally
sometime
anytime,
soon.
yeah.
Not as easy as it once was.
Right.
Yeah. So okay. Now that we're on the subject of gear, let me just spitball you a couple things, just because we're all gearheads here. Everybody that's watching. What is Chuck Ainlay going to throw in a standard session? You don't know what you're going to cut that day. It may be Americana, could be country, could be rock. What are you going to throw on the kick drum?
I'm kind of like, kind of have a thing that I do on kick drum almost always, and it's I put a AKG D112 inside the kick drum, off center back about 6 or 8 inches from the front head, or the beater head, and then I'll put a FET 47 on the front header, and that'll be away from the hole, to kind of get the warmth from the head. I mean, actually, recording Peter, he's got the drums from Comes Alive, and we've been using those. It's an old Ludwig kit with double heads, and man, that you don't need to, everybody's got a hole in their drum, and they either go inside the drum or they might get at the hole to get sort of more point. But that drum, just for some reason, you don't need to. I mean, those same couple of microphones on the outside head, it just sounds unbelievable. It's got that, but it also has the snap. You know.
Yeah. What preamps are you going to try to feed into them?
All right. Well, for drums, I love the old Neve stuff. So, I mean, I always use a 1081 module for bass drum and snare. So those microphones, I like the 4-band EQ. But then just almost everything else is a 1073 module. So toms, I don't worry so much about. I mean, I'll just use whatever the console I'm working on. But like overheads, hat, snare, bass drum, kind of.
Yeah.
I'm a Neve guy.
Yeah, understood.
Yeah.
What mics are you going to put on a piano?
My go-to for piano now is pretty much that new 5045 Audio-Technica.
Yeah.
I love it. It sounds amazing. There's a new Sanken microphone, the CUX 100K. It also has that rectangular capsule, and then they put their 100K capsule with it, so it's a dual capsule microphone. So it goes out to 100K. It's actually got a rising response at 100K. But
rising?
Yeah. It's unbelievable. On acoustic guitar, I mean, I've used it on vocals. I absolutely love that microphone.
Wow.
I'm a big DPA fan too. I like DPA microphones.
Don't you have them on drum overheads?
I always use for overheads. I kind of have developed this thing with the space bar that I do over the drums, and I like it because you can move the microphones and up and down and move it to kind of get the snare drum sort of where you want it in the stereo image, but yet you keep your sort of phase relationship locked in between the two microphones, and I like the space pair kind of approach.
Yeah, I do too.
And it's great because you can just have one mic stand, kind of cleans up the kit.
Yeah.
Rather
On the piano, are you spaced pair or are you like an OOTF?
Yeah, I do space pair. I learned this. I was doing a jazz record at Mad Hatter in LA. It was Chick Corea's studio, and at any rate, Chick Corea, right? So I go, so what does Chick use on the piano? And he said, well, he uses C12s and he puts them here. And so, I mean, I don't normally have a pair of C12s handy. So, and they don't normally you can't ever find two C12s that sound alike.
That's
So I
right,
kind of abandoned that idea, but I do still do the same sort of placement, and it's it kind of basically, if you look at a Yamaha C7 is what most studios have, and if you look at the way the bracing goes, there's a bar that goes like that and a bar that goes like that, and the hammers are here.
Yeah.
So kind of back from the hammers, kind of over that bass cleft bracing, and also back from the hammers, kind of over that other treble clef bracing.
Sounds just like what I do, probably because I snuck into this the room and tried to see what you do.
But, I mean, like the cool thing for me is I have been involved with this group called, we started up initially to do product certification, and so it was Phil Ramone, Al Schmitt, Ed Cherney, Elliot Shiner, Frank Filippetti, George Massenberg, and they included me. I mean, we'd hang out. Partially, part of this was like that group that started with Nuendo, but the other part of it was we'd go to AES conventions, and we'd always just gravitate to each other, and we'd hang out, and we'd start bitching about these magazines that, they got some kid to write this glowing review about some product, and we all knew it was crap, So it's like somebody needs to say what is actually good gear, something that we'd all use. So we started this company called MET Alliance, or Music Engineering and Technology Alliance. And unfortunately, Phil passed away, and then Eddie and Al, and so to keep the thing going, we still feel like it's an important thing to do. We've brought in Nico Bolas, who, when Eddie and Al were still around, we had every intention of bringing Nico in. It didn't happen until after they were gone, unfortunately. And now, just most recently, Sylvia Massey and Jimmy Douglas. So we've got like this incredible group of knowledge, and everybody's kind of got a little bit different way of doing things. But Al always used 149s over the hammers, and he records almost everything Omni. I mean, almost everything. And his records just always blow your mind. I mean, with Recording Academy, I've been involved with the nominating committee a lot of times for best engineered recordings, and I think Al's won like 27 Grammys or something over the years,
and deserved more.
Well, and as much as you'd hate it, you'd be sitting there listening to all these records, and then an Al Schmitt record would come on, you go, damn it, Al! You gotta put that down. He's like, exactly. It's just so good. Right, I mean, he's that great.
And I've tried some of those techniques, and he just had a magic touch. Some of the Omni stuff that worked for him. When I tried it, it's like I can't make this work. Like the producer is asking for more cello, but when I turn up the cello, I'm getting just as much viola or just as much whatever. But part of it could have been capital.
Well, part of it's capital. Part of it is he knew where to put people, and part of it he knew where to put the mic. So I mean, and
he's just better than us.
Well,
me.
I was doing mixing something in Studio C at Capitol, and Al was recording Vince Gill. And I've done a lot of work with Vince over the years. They were doing a Christmas album, and with orchestra and all that, and Vince, Vince Gill, greatest voices on the planet, was super nervous, to like have to perform live with orchestra. I was kind of just observing what was going on. He was just sitting in the back of the control room there, talking with Vince, making him feel comfortable, talking with Tony Brown was producing, they just telling stories and, trying to make him feel comfortable, like everything's going to be all right. And Steve Genowick, as great an engineer as he is, he learned so much from Al, was at the console dialing up, levels and things like that. And before the musicians turned up, I walked around the studio, and Steve had set things up, and Al went around and kind of moved things here, there, and, just kind of, and anyhow, they start running down the first song, and Al out comes from the back of the room. You know, it's sounding good. Steve's got it dialed up, sounded really good. Al basically sits down at the console, and it looked as though he just kind of went like this, like blessed the console. And all of a sudden, it sounded amazing. I mean, you know, it's just little things here and there, you know?
Yeah.
And it just like all of a sudden, it sounded like a record. And, you know, he was that talented.
Yeah, a savant.
Yeah. There'll never be anybody like him again.
Yeah, that's true. We want to do a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
When you watch some of his things, I don't. It's crazy. But you've always been really involved with the Grammys, the NARAS and things like that.
Yeah, it used to be
well.
called NARAS, or National Association of Recording Arts and Sciences. I like the arts and sciences part of it. But they changed the name to the Recording Academy. I'm not exactly quite sure why, but so that's who gives away the Grammys. And this same group of guys that I'm talking about, Ed Cherney had been over in England, and they have the Producers Guild or something like that, Music Producers Guild. And so they talked Eddie into starting a guild in America because, you know, as an engineer, we're just independents, right? We're kind of at the mercy of the record company. We don't have anybody like putting money away for, you know, retirement or any of that stuff. We just, you know, and you know, there's enough engineers in the world that will work for nothing, you know, you know, it's kind of hard to, you know, keep a standard of living. Anyhow, so Eddie thought, you know, we needed to like start a guild here and primarily to try and get terrestrial radio royalties payments to the artists. You know, we're like one of 3 countries, Russia and Iraq, I think, are the other 2, that don't pay royalties for terrestrial airplay.
Wow.
And so America's the other one, right? We're most recently, at any rate, I'll cut the story short. But so Eddie started what was Music Producers Guild of the Americas. And this group was all kind of involved with that. And we had hired lawyers and we were lobbying Congress, but we knew that we didn't have the funds to like actually get this accomplished. So Phil Ramone and Ed and Al went to, Mike Green was the president of NARAS at the time, and said, we think you need to like bring this group into the Recording Academy or NARAS. And so they did. So that's the producers and engineers wing of the Recording Academy. And so I've been been involved with that over the years, like heavily. And currently I'm like me and Leslie Ann Jones of Skywalker Ranch are the 2 co-chairs for the steering committee for that now.
Yeah, for as long as I've been involved, I just always remember you being very into the technical aspect of it, as far as like setting standards. You know, I remember reading papers on, you know, comping, you know, just as simple as comping from start to 0 at the same time and clearly naming files for archive, because we don't know what the future holds. So if we have a session that's got 1,000 little independent audio files, maybe one day we won't be able to put that back together unless, you know,
exactly.
That's one of those, when you read the paper, it's like, duh.
Now that Atmos is here, we're again seeing why we need to maintain the multi-track and be able to, like, because there's new uses for it. But yeah, we in fact a lot of the Recording Academy's document is called Delivery Recommendations. Came out of Nashville. I mean, George Massenburg was here when we started that. If you can believe it, it's like over 20 years ago when we started that document. We keep upgrading and upgrading it. In fact, a new revision is about to be released here real soon. And that document, if you don't know, go to the Grammy.com and look up guidelines and recommendations. And in there's that document, as well as many other documents that, you know, and this new revision is going to be so much easier to use, because if you want to look up something, you'll be able to like type in a search and be able to find what you're looking for. But it's extensive, and it was, you know, when do creatives and record companies ever get along. Not very often, right?
Right.
But we actually got record company people together with the producers and engineers, and we sat down and came up with this document initially. And now, like, Warner Brothers, Sony, Universal, they all basically adopted that document for delivery. And, they all have subtle little differences that they have for, what they require. But it's essentially from that document.
Yeah, I've always admired that you took, so much time to be involved in that. I know how busy our lives get, when records are going on, and how 7-day weeks and long days become a normal thing. But you always took time to make sure you were, you put your experience, out there to try to maintain standards and help other people learn how to do things properly. So,
well, that group that I was talking about, the Met Alliance, we actually have Blackbird Studios booked this coming weekend, and we're doing what we call in session. So Elliot Shiner and I are going to be in a room tracking. We're in Studio D tracking John Randall, who's an amazing songwriter, Grammy Award-winning songwriter, all with like the best studio musicians in town in that room. And then Sylvia Massey and Nico Bolas they're working with a couple of different acts in Studio A over the weekend. George Massenberg and Frank Filippetti are going to be mixing in Atmos. They're Alicia Keys and George Michaels and Korn and Jimmy Douglas is going to be mixing in Atmos, Timberlake, all that, Justin Timberlake. And so, the attendees will get to go from each room and be in there 4 hours with us each, and we just lay it all out there. This is where I put this microphone. This is the EQ I do. You're gonna get all that experience, those years and years and years of experience, just kind of all just given.
Pick and choose from the
That's cool. But that's why keep it?
That's true.
Right?
That's true.
The way I look at it is there's nothing. I do things a certain way because that's the way these hear it. Mm-hmm. And so, you're not going to have the same ears, but at least you get the advanced sort of you won't have to go through all the well, that didn't work kind of thing, right?
Exactly.
So that's, I like giving it away.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Listen, I know I've probably already kept you a lot longer than I said I would. I know you've got things to do because you're Chuck Ainley. Yeah. So hey, thanks for giving your time, giving us your time, guys. Applause for Chuck Ainley. Insert sound effect here because I'm sure everyone at home is applauding. So thanks so much for giving us the time. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time. All right, happy mixing.